Funding for Echoes of Cry of the Marsh is provided by the University of Minnesota Morris, the Upper Minnesota River Watershed District, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
As a kid, I used to come to this hillside and sit and watch the panorama of the wildlife. So I spent many hours just sitting here on the hillside. I always call it the hill. This little dip that goes down into the Marsh basin. I would come and sit on top here and watch the wildlife for hours on end. I was always watching the ducks and geese, Canada geese, mallards, a whole variety of duck species, and other geese as well. The flight of a goose or a duck has always inspired me. I just love to see these birds. I knew they were attached to that lake for their survival and lived in the lake. As a kid, I realized that was their home, just as this old farmhouse was my home.
For more than 70 years, Bob Hartkoff has walked the grounds of his family's farm in Swift County, Minnesota. As a young boy, Hartkoff wandered through the shallow wetland that grew beside his father's crops. The wetland was called Mud Lake, an ironic name that failed to describe its beauty and wildlife. But when it came to crops and springtime floods, Mud Lake seemed a more apt description in the minds of local farmers. Hartkoff, on the other hand, saw Mud Lake as a classroom. He studied the plant life and the migration patterns of local waterfowl. The education inspired him to become a high school science teacher. However, the farm Hartkoff sees today does not resemble the farm he knew as a child.
People at that time did not farm fence row to fence row. There were little nooks and crannies on the farm, little wild weed patches. Cornfields had lots more vegetation in them, and that, in fact, led to more wildlife over the entire farm.
Hartkoff was not alone in seeing the changes in the Minnesota landscape.
My dad was a great local historian in that he knew there were big stories in small places. And we would drive by these areas that at one time you'd say, there used to be a lake out there. And so we'd look out there and try to imagine what that lake might have looked like when there was nothing but corn or soybeans growing there at the time.
Any wetland that's destroyed, the biodiversity just goes to zero. It becomes a biological desert with the exception of corn, soybeans, or whatever, if it's farmed, which means you virtually have no wildlife.
As the 20th century progressed, attitudes about wetlands changed dramatically. The government initiated policy to help increase the amount of food American farmers could produce. Wetlands became the enemy.
If removing water gets me more, it's pretty hard to have another discussion if that discussion is on the surface.
I was devastated. It was just like losing one of my closest friends or family members when this marsh was drained.
Hartkoff decided he could not stand by and let these wetlands disappear into history. So in 1959, he picked up a 16mm camera and began documenting the ditching work near the family farm.
I remember Bob indirectly from my days in college, and was fairly impressed with very impressed the first time I saw the film that he produced, Cry of the Marsh, and remembered it. It made a lasting impression on me.
And I thought it was so remarkable that something that had I think a pretty significant impact on me in high school was coming back to me so much later in my career. As I started to learn more and more about Bob's story of what amounts to a 35-year odyssey to restore that one particular wetland, I couldn't help but start to share his passion for its restoration, I guess.
Hartkoff's film touched off a debate that still rages today. To drain or not to drain, that is the question. And it's a difficult one to answer in Minnesota and other states dominated by agriculture. For most of the 1960s and 70s, the mighty industry of crop production took front stage.
Farming throughout centuries in Minnesota has been like that. Just the God-given right to do what you want with your own property.
In recent years, sentiment about wetlands and farming has changed. The public has begun to understand the value of restoring wetlands and the great social cost of industrial fence-row-to-fence-row farming. Within this debate, many people stand between extremes. Conservationists call for protection of wetlands, while farmers try to maintain a profitable farm. Politicians and the public are left to decide where to find the middle.
When it's somebody else's property upstream, we're all in favor of ducks, and we think we're ecologists upstream. But as soon as the water touches our land, we become engineers, and we want to send that water downstream as fast as we can. So we want the guy upstream to dam and fill his land up with lily pads and natural grasses and everything will hold the water. But as soon as that water gets close to us, we want pumps, we want diversion channels, we want ditching.
And we saw a case a number of years ago where a fellow really drained what was called a lake and just put it on a neighbor. And so he improved probably 30 acres of his own land, but he probably ruined 25 of another, acres of another farmer's land.
What are we doing here? We got one arm of the government paying farmers to behave poorly. We have another arm of government paying farmers to try to correct the problems that are created over here. That's just craziness.
Hartkoff and others think the time has come to make serious changes in farm policy. The disappearance of wetlands from Minnesota has made a negative impact on our environment and affected our quality of life.
The ecosystem deteriorates immediately. The water's gone. Once the water's gone, usually the dry marsh bed is burned off, which is the case in this case. The marsh bed was burned, and no wildlife, period. The wildlife's gone.
The consequence of draining these small depressions into ditches that flow to main stem rivers is that we have more frequent flooding and we have more severe flooding than we ever had in the past.
Hartkoff continues his quest to see wetlands restored on his family farm, but neighboring farmers continue to drain their plots, which drains Hartkoff's land as well. Though that may seem unfair, by federal, state, and county statutes, it's completely legal. Hartkoff's quest has become a symbol for the larger debate about finding a balance for our environment, a balance between industrial profits and a healthy ecosystem.
It's an ongoing debate, and it's not an easy one to stop. Not an easy one to stop. Because when they're paying big production costs, they need big yields.
You can take a thread out of a quilt, and one thread you may not notice it, but you start plucking threads out, and pretty soon you look at it one day, and now you've got a big hole in it, and it's not the same beautiful thing that you once enjoyed and you received from your grandparents a generation ago.
You know, humans wouldn't think of going into the Museum of Natural History and destroying it, burning it down to the ground, but yet we go into a marsh which is many times more beautiful than a museum, with all these living species for the entire countryside to observe, without having to pay a fee to go in to look at dead specimens in a museum, and we destroy it. I can't buy that, and I can't stop from working on the restoration of a living, biodiverse, beautiful system.
During the age of glaciers, the fertile fields of Minnesota were covered beneath a thick carapace of ice.
Over several thousand years, that ice would melt and it would leave a depression, and that depression fills with water today, and that's a wetland. Many parts of the prairie pothole region, historically the density of these wetlands was as much as 100 per square mile in some of the densest areas. We may be the land of 10,000 lakes, but we were once the land of 10 million wetlands.
This landscape remained unchanged for the first 100 years of our country's history. However, in the middle 1800s, water and wetlands became a central issue for pioneers attempting to settle in Minnesota.
A society that can't bring water in will perish, and a society that can't push water out will perish. So the manipulation of water is not a choice once you've reached a level of complex society. In fact, you can't have a complex society on any other condition rather than manipulating waters. Water is a cost. I mean, to get rid of it or bring it, it's a cost. It will cost you labor, it will cost you machinery.
For the earliest farmers, wetlands, especially those shallow wetlands, made farming unpredictable and risky.
Farmers' acreage rose and fell with the water levels, actually. And a lot of farmers decided, well, if we can hay these sloughs off in dry years, why can't we drain them and use them all the time?
My mother and I were told at the time that we would never have to fertilize that land. It would grow all these crops for years and years and years. And all that happened was that every time we had a excessive rain, it would flood our crops out. And it made no sense to do what they did back in those days.
But those early Minnesota farmers were ingenious and exceptionally hardworking. It didn't take long before they discovered that draining wetlands could turn the cost of water into an investment.
When the farmers were out here, why not get rid of the wetlands? More farms, lower prices, more land, get rid of the mosquitoes. You can drive your cart from one place to another without having to go around or without getting stuck. There was every reason you'd want to get rid of water at that point, and the government was fully behind you.
Minnesota was just a new state, and in 1860 they were included in those Swamplands Act. I think they got jurisdiction over about 5 million acres of land to drain, and a lot of that was agricultural land. And so those state projects started in the 1860s. They didn't really develop a good water policy or drainage policy until about 1887. Bull ditchers came around, and they were essentially teams, men that owned these large teams of oxen. And the only way that they had to drain some of these smaller wetlands was to dig a ditch and drain them out. And so they'd have teams of 10 to 15 oxen attached to a huge, almost like a moldboard plow, and that plow would just simply dig a ditch from the wetland out to the nearest outlet, which would be a creek.
Draining wetlands required years of incredible effort, but the work enabled farmers to create a stable life out on the rugged prairie. The wetland that bordered on the Hartkoff farm was known as Mud Lake. It flooded every spring with rain and snowmelt. It was poor land for growing crops, but that didn't keep his neighbors from trying to drain it. It was a decision that confronted many families across Minnesota. Drain a shallow wetland and increase your farmland and possibly your profit.
As we progressed and got larger machinery and things, that what we started out with at 12 and 14 acre fields now all of a sudden became a real hindrance to that farming, because we all like to have a full 160 acres that we can drive from one end to the other, and all those things encourage drainage.
In the early 1900s, the bull ditchers became steam ditchers, and the rate of drainage across Minnesota increased exponentially as machine technology advanced. Though draining wetlands was a relatively new event on the Minnesota frontier, sportsmen immediately noticed the effect.
They would spend days out hunting, and they often were the ones who were protesting. They were the ones who saw an environmental impact of losing these wetlands, that they were going to be losing hunting land, they were going to be losing places where their families could swim and picnic. And they often led the charge, like today.
Despite these early protests, the push to maximize crop production had just too much momentum. After the World Wars, the U.S. government saw agriculture as a means for shoring up the country's food supply and securing America's place in global politics.
America was now being perceived as the entity that was going to feed the world, and so there was a big incentive to put the latest and greatest technology into the hands of farmers. And one of the things they used it for was increased drainage of wetlands.
Most of our ditches in Minnesota were created prior to 1940. I would say by 1940, 45, we had about 27,000 miles of ditch in Minnesota. But we were also tiling, farm tiling was becoming more and more efficient, so we were tiling more and more water into those ditches.
You're going to be prone to find tiling with farmers who have excess capital for investment, because it does cost money. They're going to tend to have flatter land. And they're going to be in counties where the ditch systems are more articulated, probably in most cases, because then they can feed the tiling into those systems.
Then we start to see flooding, possibly. We start to see watersheds jumping their banks and going into other watersheds.
By the 1970s, the landscape of Minnesota had been completely changed.
If you're sitting in southwest Minnesota or northern Iowa, you're probably looking at wetland drainage rates that exceed 90, 95%. That means fewer than 10% of your natural wetlands remain, and there are many watersheds where there are no small depressional wetlands left.
American agriculture had entered the modern age. Maintaining high production meant using every possible acre. This also meant less time and fewer resources farmers could devote to keeping their land clean.
In order to farm huge acreages, they need huge machines. They don't have time to do the recycling, so they have to put in chemical inputs, fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides. So to me, we've lost that close connection that the earlier farmers had with the land, and today it's following the desires of the big corporations and their inputs. Wetlands are more productive on a per unit basis than an Iowa cornfield. 1 acre of wetland produces more in the form of plants and animals than does an acre of Iowa farmland. So people simply aren't accustomed to the idea that these wetlands are extremely valuable.
Wetlands are natural filters for nutrients like nitrates. When the nitrates flow into a wetland from the upland cropland that surrounds the wetland, the result is that they are lost to the atmosphere through a process called denitrification, so that the water that ultimately exits a wetland is cleaner than the water that entered.
As individuals, we need some connection to the natural world, and wetlands and prairie out here are the 2 biggest communities that this area has.
Few would argue the value of agriculture to the state of Minnesota's economy. Many believe that wetlands stood in the way of future profits. But in today's age of superabundance, some are asking, what have we lost in exchange?
being here in western Minnesota in the prairie pothole region, we have a particularly strong responsibility for migratory birds and in particular waterfowl, trying to provide breeding habitat and migration habitat for waterfowl and other birds that depend on the prairie wetlands and the grasslands that once covered this entire area.
When the prairie pothole portion of North America is wet, 2/3 of the entire continent's duck production may come out of this small part of the continent. And in fact, it's the prairie pothole region that drives the pulse in duck numbers that we occasionally see. When the pothole region is wet, we see continental populations spike. And when the pothole region is dry, we see the duck populations enter and persist in a long, slow decline.
Wetlands come in several forms, ranging in size from small marshes to small lakes. Generally, wetlands are classified into 4 groups. Temporary wetlands hold water from 1 week to 1 month during the growing seasons and provide valuable food and nutrition to female waterfowl. Seasonal wetlands hold water up to 60 days during the growing season and feature ground cover for duck pairs to isolate themselves for breeding. Semi-permanent wetlands hold water in the spring and summer unless a drought persists. Ducklings are raised here amidst the brush and native grasses. Permanent wetlands are usually more than 6 feet deep and sometimes confused with small lakes. Mud Lake near Hartkoff's farm was classified as a semi-permanent and permanent wetland. Ducklings could hide in the bulrushes around the edge. But when Mud Lake was drained, the ducklings and other waterfowl simply disappeared.
A lot of people think they leave, so what? They just move over to another marsh or whatever, which isn't the case at all, because the other marshes are occupied fully by other plants and animals. And they don't just leave and go to another marsh and exist there. They disappear. That group of wildlife simply disappears forevermore.
If you drain most of the small temporary wetlands that only hold water from 7 to at most 2 to 3 weeks during the growing season, you will eliminate most of your breeding population of ducks. They simply will not settle in this part of the state, this part of the continent.
It's just been in the last 20 years that we have realized that maybe it's a good idea that we replant some of these prairies, that we restore some of these wetlands, and not just for the diversity of wildlife and critters, but for the health of the landscape and for the health of the community.
They offer a buffering capacity to the land. The water from a heavy rainfall event or snow melt that would otherwise go and contribute to a flood in Montevideo or in Fargo or in St. Paul.
Flood damage reduction is one of the primary reasons that we restore wetlands today. And in fact, if you were to look at the prairie pothole region landscape at the time of European settlement, as little as 10 or 20% of the landscape may have actually contributed to river flow. Water ran off the land into the rivers. The other 80–90% flowed into small depressions like these. Now, when you drain all of these small depressions into a main stem river, the result is predictable. You get much more frequent flooding and you get much more severe floods.
We'll have a 100-year flood event, and it seems like every 5 or 10 years we have a 100-year flood event. Well, part of that is because we've changed the equation. The land cannot hold the water because we've lost our wetlands. The land can't hold the water the way it once could.
Flood prevention is just one natural control that wetlands provide. They also filter pollutants and keep them from our rivers, lakes, and water tables.
Any pesticides that come in, herbicides that come into the marshlands are taken up by the plants, cattails and other plants, so that they don't get into the river systems like the Minnesota River or the Mississippi River.
Today, thousands of tons of farm chemicals from Minnesota leach into the Mississippi River, and they become a problem for our neighbors to the south.
We believe that that's a function of the runoff primarily of nitrogen fertilizers from the intensively farmed portions of the Mississippi River watershed. Ironically, the Minnesota River watershed here in southern Minnesota is one of the worst polluters in terms of total contribution of nitrogen to the problem associated with Gulf hypoxia, we believe.
Then all of a sudden it looks like we cut water a cheap deal, so we sold it on the cheap. Now we've got to figure out how we can save what we can save, or even put back what we can put back, because it's a long-term asset we need for other purposes.
I go to a lot of classrooms, and almost all the time the little kids will bring up, and you got to love them. I mean, they'll bring up the fact that, the rainforest, and sometimes the teachers will even have posters or taking up collections or selling something or to protect the rainforest. And it just slays me is that we drained 95 to 99% of the prairie wetlands in Minnesota and across the Corn Belt. We destroyed and converted 99.9% of the native tallgrass prairies out here, but yet we have the gall to teach our children that we should be scolding third world countries on clearing their rainforest. I mean, it just kills me.
50 years ago, ecology was a new term in the English language. Books from early conservationists such as Aldo Leopold and Rachel Carson inspired us to take a fresh look at the effects of modern farming on our ecosystem. Bob Hartkoff was one of the people who adopted this new perspective.
Well, the farm is an ecosystem, and the marsh is an ecosystem. And the marsh is tremendously diverse and rich. And farms can be tremendously diverse and rich, except we have, through our operations on most farms today, reduced that richness to kind of a monotone production. We've got corn and soybeans.
Though he no longer lived on the family farm in Swift County, Hartkoff was determined to record the changes wrought by large-scale drainage, and he was determined to restore the rich variety of plant and animal life he knew in his youth. But as he would soon learn, his options were limited.
So we're seeing something that approaches the look of the early grasslands throughout North America, which is just a small remnant is left. I think there's less than 5% of the early grasslands left. So what we're seeing are some of those original plants which dominated the prairie. My parents moved to this farm in the mid-20s, just prior to the Depression. And I was born in 1931 during the Depression, so it was a hardscrabble time for my parents making a go of it here, as it was for all the farmers in this countryside. So as a young kid, I would go down in the marsh and bring back a few ducks or a few pheasants or whatever, and felt like I was really making quite a contribution to the survival of this farm. I remember my dad telling us that it's important not to overharvest. If you want a pheasant to eat, fine. If you want some venison, take a deer. But he always emphasized the fact that you don't want to overharvest any of these animals. They have a part to play, and we simply need them. We just use what we can, and the natural reproduction will take care of itself to replenish them. Years ago, I used to see prairie chickens which migrated short distances. Years ago, I'd see prairie chicken flocks coming out of the north and passing over this marsh bed and passing over the farmyard. In fact, my brother shot a few prairie chickens that I can remember, so I was a part of the prairie chicken scene years and years ago. But they, of course, have been non-existent here for years in this area. Even as a kid of 5 or 6, I was continually drawn to the marsh, would go into the marsh, put on some boots, and grub around, looking at the plants and the animals, and got a real good sense for the ecology of that marsh at a very early age. I think my dad was ahead of his time in looking at the farm as a whole. I think he actually saw the farm, even though he didn't know what the term meant, I think he actually saw the farm as an ecosystem. And he believed in a healthy ecosystem and very much related to everything that was going on the farm, both domestic animals and wild animals. In those days of more diverse farms, people made a living by raising diverse crops and livestock. And you can say that the same thing happens in nature. The more diverse something is, the more stable something is. People would come with their horses in teams to an individual farm to thresh out the grain. So it was a lot more community-oriented. And we all shared doing things together, spent a lot more time together. The initial drainage started in 1910, believe it or not, and that was done with a horse-drawn dredge. That enterprise was unsuccessful simply because they didn't have the big machines.
They didn't have big machines, but later they would. In the 1960s, old systems were lined with tile for faster drainage, and new systems tapped into old ones.
When they did the job with these huge machines, they also used dynamite. So they would dynamite these trees along the ditch, some of which ended on the roof of our barn. I mean, you'd hear this huge dynamite blast, and part of a huge tree would land on the barn roof. It was like war.
I think his heart was broke when the marsh was actually drained. And I think he'd do anything and everything possible to see it restored. And he doesn't mean it to be against farmers or anything. He's doing it truly just because in his own heart, that's what he wants to see done.
The more I thought about it, being I was virtually helpless to do anything about stopping the drainage, I thought the least I could do would be to expose it to a wide audience. The film was finally put together in the late 60s. And we decided at that time to hold it until 1970 for release. So it was released in the neighborhood, at least, of the first Earth Day. We entered a number of festivals, and it won awards in 6 or 8 festivals, including New York, Washington, D.C., Berlin. So it got a wide amount of coverage. It was shown on TV several places, and that got the film out there for the public to see. And I don't think a lot of people realized that that sort of thing was happening to the wildlife, and from the wildlife's perspective, you might say. I don't think they made the connection, really, until that time. I get some feedback every once in a while about a marsh being saved. But ironically, this marsh has not yet been saved. The one that I filmed being devastated. Well, the impact of Cry of the Marsh on my neighbors is largely unknown because I haven't really spoken to them about the film, and they haven't spoken to me about the film. But I'm sure they feel that what they're doing is more important than the marsh existing as a marsh.
When I first saw Cry of the Marsh, the film, it's just so sad because it's such a common story. It's a common tragedy that it's been repeated over and over and over again. Now, Bob was one of the few that took the time to document it and to do something about it. But it's a story that's been repeated thousands upon thousands upon thousands of times. And it's just inherently sad, I guess, to me.
I understand that people do have to make a living on a farm, and sometimes it's hard not to farm, even if it means destroying a wetland. But I think there are other ways of gaining income, and people are finding there are other ways of gaining income from a farm. And some of the farmers, of course, have a lot of land and probably could use a little diversity in their land as well. So if they're not struggling, it's hard for me to understand draining a marsh and destroying a beautiful, diverse ecosystem.
Since the earliest days of statehood, the right to drain wetlands has been protected by a set of laws that enable farmers to maximize crop production.
Current drainage law is an old law, and it allows for one group, or sometimes in some cases if even an individual landowner has enough land in one particular area, to force a drainage or an improvement of or a restoration of a drainage system over another landowner or group of landowners based on the amount of land they have in the system or the number of acres of benefited land in a particular drainage system.
Through a legal drainage system, if you have several landowners that will be involved, and let's say only one or two people are for the project, what happens is if there's more than 50% of that land is owned by the individuals that want to put the tile in or the ditch system in, it is petitioned before the board or before the watershed district, and if they have that 50%, it has to be allowed.
That's the catch, you know, even though a number of farmers now have government programs in the lake bottom, there are 2 or 3 farmers left out of 7 would still want to farm that land.
In actuality, I personally feel that probably our drainage laws have like Minnesota's drainage laws, have probably created a good deal of drainage because farmers kind of get in a panic mood and saying, well, boy, I better get busy and get that drained or they're not going to let me do it anymore.
Since the late 1960s, ditching and tiling permits in the state of Minnesota have been evaluated and issued by watershed districts. Watershed districts are primarily concerned with how farmland drainage affects flood control and water quality. Hartkoff's farm sits in the Upper Minnesota Watershed District. It is the largest drain basin in the entire district.
When a permit request comes in, we usually have to look at the entire area that they want to drain. We go through old photos starting back in the 1980s. We look for wetlands, possible wet spots that should not be drained. We do that first locally in the office. Then we go out on site with the farmer. He explains exactly where he wants his ditches to go, how much he wants to deepen them. So we do a really thorough with the farmers. The biggest dispute is always, I want to get rid of my water, but I don't want anybody else's, is the biggest dispute. And somebody, cleans out a ditch and it runs down onto the neighbor, and that causes a battle.
Current law favors drainage, but farmers do have conservation options in the form of set-aside and buyback programs funded by federal and state governments. The Conservation Reserve Program, otherwise known as CRP, is a USDA program that pays farmers for up to 10 years in exchange for allowing a piece of land to return to its natural state. The Reinvest in Minnesota program, or RIM, enticed farmers to restore sensitive lands by offering payment up front and arranging a contract to determine the future use of that land. The Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, or CREP, took over where CRP ended. Under CREP, farmers agreed to take certain lands out of farm use permanently.
And when we enroll a wetland in a restoration program or in a protection program, we try to compensate that landowner appropriately because we know its preservation does come at a cost to them.
I have several pieces of land in RIM program, And I also have 2 filter strips along natural drainage ravines that are in the CREP program. And in my case, that's been very, very successful. I actually get more rent on that land than I do on the land that I rent out for farming.
My rim acres down there don't look like it, but it's probably my highest priced land if I wanted to sell it, which I don't. But recreational land nowadays is an extremely lucrative chunk of property to have.
Under all 3 programs, CRP, CREP, and RIM, farmers are compensated relative to the crop capability of the land. However, despite the intentions of federal and state conservation programs, some farmers feel the payments and set-asides are not in their best interests.
It's kind of tough for me to tell my renter that I'm going to allow ponding on my land because I'm going to change my intakes to a different type of an intake, and he's paying me good money for this land.
The motivation for those individuals that no matter what hold out, it's more of an issue of government, is what it comes down to. There are several farmers out there that just would do anything not to have the government have any say in their land, in their property. It's just a right that they feel like they should be able to make the decision themselves and nobody else.
The message is that this is a local issue. This is an issue of landowner rights over the rights of maybe the greater public. That's still an issue today. I mean, that's still the idea that we can control what's going on our own land, no matter what anybody around us, how they might be affected.
Farming is more in the category of being a gamble. You borrow a bunch of money and invest in putting in a crop, and you hope that at the end that you get enough wage to come out in a profitable end. There's really no guarantees. You can take insurance and things like that, but probably that'll only be enough to say you broke even.
Risk, survival, history, resistance to change. Taken together, these worldly and human traits complicate our relationship to the land, and especially wetlands.
There's still a feeling on the part of farmers that if you take land out of agriculture, you're not allowing it its best use. That's still a real priority for farmers, is that you're not using that land. And by leaving it fallow, then you're wasting its potential.
Farmers are getting, as of today, prices for the crops that existed 40, 50 years ago, no higher. So it seems to me, by leaving a marsh, creating fewer surpluses, farmers will be getting more money for the crops.
It's very evident that we have more farmland available than we need right now. And technology has been more than able to keep up with the increase in demand. So, yeah, you're still buying a loaf of bread for $1.50, but production costs for a lot of these operators have gone a lot higher proportionally than that.
Well, I think we've been sold a bill of goods. I think farmers simply have been sold the idea by these large corporations that in order to produce a crop, you have to use these things. You have to use these herbicides, you have to use these pesticides.
Farmers will do to the land what's profitable for them, what keeps their family fed and what keeps their operation moving. The government policies dictate those things. But not just that. I think more and more corporations dictate how farmers are going to be able to farm their land as well.
We need to come together and sit down and say, we need to be smart about this. We need to raise food, we need wildlife, we need clean water. What can we do? Where can we go to find the right balance point between wetland drainage and wetland restoration?
Do they appreciate seeing birds fly over the farmyard? Do they appreciate seeing a pheasant on the roadside? Do they appreciate seeing a buck deer in the marsh edge? If they appreciate diversity, I can't see how they can feel that the marsh is worthless. It would simply mean plugging up the outlet, plugging up the ditch, so the marsh would fill with water, and that would not take more than a year or two. Once the marsh is filled with water, some of the original vegetation, which is still in the soil, will begin to reestablish itself.
We know where these drained wetlands are, we know how to restore them, and all we lack is the will as a society to decide how many of them we need to restore and where we're going to do that to benefit not only wildlife but also clean up water and reduce flooding problems and things like that. And I think we have the technology to help us make informed decisions now so that we can pick and choose and say, if we're only going to restore 10 wetlands in this particular area, which 10 should we restore out of the 1,000 that might be there? We can pick and choose the ones that do the most environmental good, clean up the water the best, will raise the most ducks, will help other non-game birds, will help flood control.
By blaming farmers for things, you're putting the blame on 2% of the people. And the other 98% feel real good about themselves because the farmers are the ones that are guilty about it. Until we all get the idea that I have a part to play in this, it probably won't get any better.
They're more than willing to listen. What they're really looking at is the bottom line, how they can make money off of a piece of ground that they have. They're not out to ruin anything. They're not out to destroy any part of the environment. What they're trying to do is make the land pay for itself.
My hope over the next 10 years is that we can work together smartly to figure out how we can meet the dual needs of agricultural production and conservation in this landscape.
It's not farmers that I have trouble with, it's the government that I have trouble with. Give me the right program. Give me the right program that makes sense, that pays farmers enough in order to make ends meet, and they will do what's right.
There's several elderly farmers out there that will never forget that. You know, I actually got paid to do this, I did not do anything wrong, and now they kind of have the temperament where now you're trying to blame me, that a lot of the problems are my fault even though the government paid me to do them.
So many times we want to personalize the whole thing. You know, it's your fault. You're a farmer, and so you screwed this up. My water's dirty. I don't have any wildlife left. You know, hey, we did that as a society, and we're still doing it to this day. And it all boils down to money.
In a state made prosperous and strong by agriculture, no one wants to hold farmers or any group responsible for dirty water, floods, or declining bird populations. The real culprit is a body of law slanted toward drainage and unready to commit itself to cleaning up the state's water and restoring the state's wetlands. The Minnesota Wetlands Conservation Act, passed in 1991, was lauded as a positive step for restoration. However, the law exempts wetlands smaller than 2 acres. It's these smaller, ephemeral wetlands that are most important to waterfowl and flood control, and most troubling to crop production. This is just one example. There are several others.
Right now, farmers are paid by how many acres they farm and how many bushels they raise. And that's a defeatist way to pay people if you're concerned about the environment.
I don't think anybody is advocating or suggesting that we're going to go in and restore all of the wetlands that were drained in Minnesota. That's just not realistic, and it's probably not desirable.
The status quo of farm programs is not giving us the benefits that we need.
We as taxpayers have to demand more out of that farm program than what we are getting. What happens is that so many times conservation gets thrown the bone. I mean, you know, we're going to spend $200 million on the commodity end, and we'll throw 8, 9, 10 million towards conservation to keep those people happy.
I think we have to realize that we need to spend our dollars a little more wisely and look for permanent change and permanent restoration of some of these habitats rather than Band-Aid approaches of some of the past farm programs.
Today, the picture has changed somewhat in that more and more people are beginning to understand that the marshes, biodiverse places in general, are extremely valuable to human beings.
Today, dealing with the decisions of 100 years ago, when a whole different mindset, a whole different understanding of the environment, we're working now with biological boundaries, where back then we were working with man-made boundaries, and trying to redevelop things that have been gone for 100 years.
We need to balance the rights and needs of the individual with the rights and needs of everybody else, the rest of society, so that if I can do something to my land, for example, that benefits me, but it hurts 5 other people, where do we draw the line? And that's a very difficult, very, very difficult question.
But the hard part is trying to get it through the political system. And of course, all the special interests that are out there fueling the decisions that are made in Washington through the Farm Bill. I mean, you know, and we all know who those people are.
Maybe the minister has to curse the people on Sunday and the banker has to educate them on Monday. And if you can get the minister and the banker saying the same message and then throw the government in on Tuesday, then maybe in some kind of odd combination that produces that mixture of model, habit, and so on.
Whatever my decision is to do on this farm, and that's whether I use the plow or whether I use the chisel plow, that decision doesn't only affect this farm. It goes beyond this farm.
The Reinvest in Minnesota license plate. It's a crying shame when, you know, all the cars on the road ought to be Reinvest in Minnesota license plate. Really, it's $30. I mean, come on, you know, it's a half a tank of gas. It's just going to have to take more commitment by people that say they like these things.
We need people to be informed. We need people to be engaged with the political process, whatever their viewpoint. I mean, they might think precisely the opposite of what I think. If I come to the table and they come to the table, I think we'll end up with a better product at the end.
We found that the greatest restoration projects are ones that are grassroots, local driven. They've gotten state organizations on board. They've gotten the federal organizations on board with it. And it's a collaboration of local, state, and federal that actually creates a successful restoration project.
But if you won't buy their product, unless to get that long ear, they've got to use fertilizer. And to eliminate the worm in the end, they got to use insecticide. Now I said, if you won't buy their little ear, then who's asking for the big ear? I said, you can't put all the blame on the farmer because you won't buy his product unless he does that.
Each of these ideas stresses the need for collaboration. Restoring wetlands in Minnesota requires that we all do our part, farmer and consumer, voter and legislator.
I think the lesson is it did work many, many years ago to do it simply. You know, people raised livestock, they were diverse, the manure went back on the land, commercial fertilizers were not necessary, pesticides were not necessary. Once you have a healthy ecosystem, you can cut down on the pesticide use. Once you have a healthy ecosystem, you can cut down on the fertilizer use. If you recycle natural systems the way nature does, you can cut back. What else can I do? You know, I've been working on this so damn long, but I'm still not sick of it. I'm still persistent. I'm right, I'm not going to give up.
we need people with Bob's optimism, and I think Bob's long-term commitment there is, in the end, going to pay off.
Even the people that will never see that place and never see that marsh, whether it remains drained or whether it's restored, it has an effect on all of us because land use in one place radiates out and it has an effect.
Since releasing Cry of the Marsh in 1970, Bob Hartkoff has worked tirelessly to promote his film, to promote the benefits of conservation, of biodiversity, and of course, wetland restoration. A recent battle with cancer has limited his efforts, but he still hopes that one day his marsh will be restored. It would be a personal triumph, but more importantly, he believes it would signal a change in our attitude about stewardship and conservation.
Anybody who has that much passion deserves to be rewarded for it one way or another. I think the fact that for 35 years he's shown that video all across the country and that wetland has yet to be restored is a testament to the fact that change is slow and change is painful. But we're getting there, and I'm confident that at some point in the not too distant future that wetland will be restored, and I hope it happens within Bob's lifetime.
Aristotle said people need good examples to learn how to do the good because they themselves find it really hard in themselves to imagine it and then practice the good. Well, if that is true, and I'm prone to think people need examples. Most people don't come to the good on their own or find enough initiative on their own to do it. They need examples.
I think it would be a very fine thing if Bob Hartkoff could walk along the shores of his marsh and not see that marsh crying, not see the cry of the marsh, but instead see the joy, see laughter, see the joy of a flock of ducks landing, the joy of seeing an eagle swooping across that marsh, of hearing a chorus of birds singing and of frogs in the springtime.
You know, humans wouldn't think of going into the Museum of Natural History and destroying it, burning it down to the ground, but yet we go into a marsh which is many times more beautiful than a museum, with all these living species for the entire countryside to observe, without having to pay a fee to go in to look at dead specimens in a museum, and we destroy it. I can't buy that, and I can't stop from working on the restoration of a living, biodiverse, beautiful system.
To order a DVD copy of Echoes of Cry of the Marsh, contact Pioneer Public Television toll-free at 800-726-3178 or visit online at www.pioneer.org. "40 years ago, Bob Hartkoff made a film about the destruction of wetlands in Minnesota. He called it Cry of the Marsh. His film touched off a debate about the environmental cost of industrial-sized farming. Now, 40 years later, is it too late to find a balance in the Minnesota landscape between wetlands and farming? Are we still hearing echoes of that cry of the marsh?